under the vast chandelier of Kingsley's, 1,000 fragile crystals swayed faintly as though the room itself was breathing in unison with the boy who stood trembling in his steel braces. Liam's small hand, pale with nerves yet stubborn in its steadiness, hovered in the charged space between him and the woman he had chosen. Maya Ellis, her apron folded and set aside, felt the tension of every pair of eyes boring into her back. But she let them fade until there was only him. The restaurant manager's words still hung in the air like smoke, sharp and demeaning, but she ignored them. The weight of silence had pressed against her shoulders many times before in this place. The hush that followed whenever her skin reminded wealthy patrons that she was not part of their curated porcelain world. Tonight, however, she refused to bend. Liam's chest rose and fell like a bird struggling to take flight, but the courage in his question deserved an answer. With deliberate calm, Maya placed her hand in his, allowing his uncertain grip to settle with a dignity that transformed the act into a pact. She had not taken a child's hand. She had accepted the lead of someone who had long been denied the chance to direct his own steps. The pianist, sensing a change that words could not capture, softened the melody into something fragile and slow. A woman at one table whispered that the waitress had lost her mind, and another man scoffed that this was beneath them. Yet the voices were dim against the sound of metal scraping softly across polished wood. Liam moved with effort, each step a war between gravity and will, and Maya responded not with guidance but with respect. She gave him space, stepping where he led, never correcting the stumbles, never robbing him of the fragile bloom of agency. The guests who had moments before commanded the air with laughter and deals now found themselves holding their breath, unsure if what they witnessed was foolishness, defiance, or something holy. Grant Marshall sat rigid at the head of the VIP table, his fork idle, his throat clenched around words he had used 1,000 times before to restore order and protect his son from shame. Sit down, do not embarrass yourself, obey. But tonight those commands seemed to rot before they reached his lips. The boy's wobbling figure, fragile as glass, seemed to carry the shadow of Olivia, the woman who had once filled his home with warmth. Her words from long ago seeped into him unbidden. It is not perfection, Grant. It is connection. 3 faltering steps later, the boy's face broke into a smile that had been absent for years. A smile not shaped by therapists' coaxing or by toys bought at any price, but born of his own power. The restaurant trembled with the echo of it. An unpracticed joy that mocked the rigid etiquette of wealth. Maya's posture was serene, but inside she carried the fire of someone who had learned through countless humiliations that dignity cannot be handed out. It must be defended. She bowed slightly when Liam finally released her hand, and her voice carried a gravity that hushed the room further when she thanked him. She was not speaking as an employee appeasing a customer's child, but as an equal recognizing another equal. Then she turned to leave. Her shift ended not by a clock but by a choice that would mark her forever. The billionaire father, whose word was law in boardrooms and trading floors, found himself stripped of command by a gesture he could not buy. His chair screeched as he rose, card in hand, voice softer than he knew it could be when he asked her name and set an appointment into motion that would alter not only his son's trajectory but his own. Outside, the city night hummed with cabs and neon, indifferent to what had occurred beneath Kingsley's chandeliers. But inside the father's mind a war began. The memory of control clashed with the vision of his son's independence. The weight of wealth, power, and legacy pressed hard against the raw truth he could no longer deny. The boy did not need rescue. He needed room to lead, to falter, to rise. The waitress's quiet rebellion had forced that truth into daylight. Grant Marshall's empire, gleaming and immense, suddenly felt insufficient against the unsteady scrape of his son's brace across a polished floor. The night had drawn a boundary not of contracts or wealth but of humanity, and for the first time in years Grant felt both powerless and alive. The chandelier above still quivered faintly, as if the crystals themselves had been unsettled by 3 trembling steps that had redrawn the axis of more than one life. The marble floors of Marshall Tower reflected every flicker of light like frozen water, their sterile polish designed to project permanence, control, and authority. Grant Marshall had built this monument of glass and steel, not only as the headquarters of his empire, but as a fortress against vulnerability. Yet on that morning, as Maya Ellis stepped through the revolving doors in a navy dress that had been pressed the night before with an iron that hissed louder than her heart, Something invisible shifted in the foundation of the tower. The receptionist, sleek hair pinned and voice honed to velvet efficiency, looked her over with the detached appraisal of someone accustomed to judging by surface. A call was made, a button pressed, and Maya was told to proceed to the 18th floor. Every step across the gleaming lobby felt amplified, as though the building itself was scrutinizing her presence. But Maya did not falter. She had carried trays heavier than her nerves, had faced dismissal sharper than any polished marble stare. What she carried into that elevator was not fear, but the resolve of someone who had lived on the edge of survival long enough to recognize that moments of truth arrive rarely, and when they do, they must be faced with unflinching steadiness. The mirrored elevator walls multiplied her reflection, casting her image into endless repetitions of the same navy dress, the same worn fabric bag, the same determined eyes. She thought of her sister Zoe, of the community center they had built together, of the children who came with braces, walkers, and wheelchairs, children who carried laughter despite the world's insistence on pity. Freedom Steps was their creation, a fragile sanctuary stitched together with late nights, borrowed mats, donated instruments, and relentless determination. It had always been close to collapsing under rent and utility bills, yet it had also been the only place where children like Liam could feel ownership over their bodies. The thought of Liam, the boy whose trembling hand had reshaped an entire dining hall the night before, strengthened her spine. When the elevator doors opened to a hallway lined with framed awards, she stepped forward without hesitation. Miss Quinn, Grant's chief of staff, met her with a smile that was polished to brilliance but carried the edge of condescension. Her blazer was cut to perfection, her voice measured to suggest efficiency laced with superiority. She guided Maya down the corridor with steps that implied the distinction between those who belonged in these halls and those who were intruders. In the waiting room, Quinn lowered her voice to something akin to advice but sharpened with cruelty. "He probably fired you," she said. "Powerful men like him do not forgive staff who forget their place." Maya tilted her head slightly, her smile a thin blade of humorless composure. "People like me," she asked, "meaning what?" Quinn blinked, caught for a moment between her script and Maya's refusal to accept it. "Staff who do not know their place," she repeated with brittle certainty. Maya let the silence stretch, a silence she had learned was often more cutting than any retort. Then the phone chimed, and Quinn informed her that Mr. Marshall was ready. Grant's office was a vast chamber of glass overlooking Manhattan, a view that turned the city into a miniature map of conquest. He stood with his back turned, hands clasped behind him, a figure carved out of wealth and command. When he finally turned, his eyes scanned her with the same calculation he applied to balance sheets and acquisitions. Yet beneath the surface of that gaze was the faint shadow of the man who had sat frozen the night before, watching his son take 3 trembling steps into independence. He invited her to sit, and for a long moment he let silence weigh heavy between them. It was a tactic designed to unnerve, to force confessions. But Maya had endured greater silences, the kind that followed slurs, the kind that filled empty cupboards, the kind that stretched between one overdue rent notice and the next. She met his silence with calm, her breathing steady, her posture unyielding. Grant began to recite her history, his voice flat but his eyes betraying flickers of surprise. A bachelor's degree in child development from NYU, graduate studies in special education, unfinished due to financial strain. 3 jobs held simultaneously: waitress, bookstore clerk, part-time tutor. A file was produced, pages turned, photographs of Freedom Steps laid bare on the desk. Maya recognized them instantly. The faded posters they had painted by hand, the worn wooden floor they had polished with hours of labor, the faces of children caught mid-motion in dances that ignored the word impossible. Grant's tone remained clinical as he pointed out the failing funding, the looming closure, the weight of debts that threatened to crush the program. He delivered these facts as if they were weapons, expecting them to pierce her. Maya did not flinch. She had lived with the knowledge of fragility for years. To see it printed on expensive paper did not change its truth. When Grant finally spoke of his son, his voice shifted. It was not the commanding tone of the empire builder, but something rawer, dragged unwillingly from his throat. "I have hired the best specialists," he said, listing neurologists, therapists, and psychologists as though reciting the components of a machine. "But what you did last night?" He faltered, unwilling to name what he could not quantify. Maya finished for him. "It was just a dance." "No," he replied. "It was the first time I have seen him smile since the accident." The admission left him exposed, vulnerable in a way he had not been for years. He leaned forward then, using the weapon that had never failed him. Money. "I want you to work for me," he said. "I will pay you 5 times what you earn now. You will be a therapeutic companion for Liam." His words were precise, designed to offer salvation while maintaining ownership. But Maya heard the truth beneath them. He was not offering her a role. He was attempting to purchase her dignity. She stood, her movements slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision that might alter her entire future. "No," she said simply. Grant's eyes widened, not in anger but in disbelief. No one refused him. Not politicians, not competitors, not even those who had sworn to despise him. But Maya did. She explained with calm clarity that his son deserved more than someone paid to pretend to care, that she would not trade her dignity for his convenience, that her work was not for sale. She placed a card on his desk instead, the address of Freedom Steps, an invitation not to hire her but to allow his son to choose for himself. Then she left, her back straight, her steps unhurried, her presence lingering in the room long after the door had closed. Grant remained motionless, staring at the card as if it were a riddle written in a language he had never learned. Miss Quinn hovered at the doorway, her composure rattled by the audacity she had just witnessed. "Shall I dismiss her permanently?" she asked. Grant's voice cut through the room like steel. "Get me everything on Freedom Steps." His gaze had not left the card. For the first time in years he had been confronted with something that money could not bend, and it unsettled him more than any financial threat. As Maya walked out of the mirrored halls of Marshall Tower, her phone buzzed with a message from Zoe. Another funding deal had collapsed, the rent was still unpaid, the future of their program hung by a thread. Maya's reply was simple. "Keep Wednesday free. Leave one frame on the wall empty." When Zoe called to ask why, Maya looked at her own reflection in the glass doors of the tower and answered, "For the future." Then she stepped into the sunlight, her dignity intact, her path uncertain but hers alone. The red brick building that housed Freedom Steps looked small and worn against the towers of Manhattan. Its painted sign faded by weather and time, yet inside it carried an energy that no skyscraper could contain. On a Wednesday afternoon, the floor hummed with the rhythm of children whose bodies refused to obey conventional patterns, but who still moved with a freedom that belonged only to them. Some dragged braces, some relied on crutches, others leaned on wheelchairs that squeaked against the varnished wood, but each of them possessed a rhythm that defied pity. Maya Ellis stood at the front of the room, her hair tied back, her blouse rolled at the sleeves, her voice steady as she encouraged one child to lift a foot, another to spin with the support of a partner, another to raise arms in victory despite trembling muscles. To an outsider, the space might have looked chaotic, a jumble of uneven steps and broken lines, but Maya knew it was harmony, messy, raw, but true. Every child was leading in their own way. Every child was proving that worth could not be measured in symmetry or grace, but in courage. In the back of the hall, Grant Marshall stood hidden, the collar of his dark coat pulled tight as though he were shielding himself from a storm. He had come unannounced, his driver instructed to wait outside, his presence a secret even from Liam. For a man who had always demanded red carpets and boardroom respect, standing unseen in a peeling warehouse felt foreign, yet he could not pull himself away. He watched the children and their parents, saw the way Maya moved between them with patience and dignity, never condescending, never pitying, always treating them as equals. He heard the laughter, raw and unpolished, but filled with a life that echoed painfully against the silence of his own penthouse. He remembered the dance at Kingsley's, his son's faltering smile, and for the first time since the accident, he wondered whether the fortress he had built around Liam had not protected him but imprisoned him. Maya noticed him only when the session ended, and the parents began to gather coats and bags. She did not startle, did not bow her head as she might have at Kingsley's, but approached with the same calm that had guided her refusal in his office. "You came," she said simply, as if she had expected him all along. Grant did not answer immediately. His gaze moved to the mats, the children, the posters painted with slogans in childish handwriting. He saw a boy in a wheelchair grin as his mother helped him pack his bag, and the expression pierced deeper than any market downturn had ever cut him. Finally, he admitted in a low voice, "I wanted to see if it was real." Maya's expression did not shift. "Reality does not need your approval," she replied. But if you want Liam to know himself, this is where he belongs. The next evening, Liam sat in the living room of the penthouse, a chessboard between him and his father. The city glowed outside the vast windows, but Liam's focus was on the black and white pieces he nudged across the board with difficulty. Grant watched, his mind not on the game but on the memory of the children at Freedom Steps. He saw in their faces the possibility of resilience, and in his son's cautious movements he recognized the same hunger for autonomy. Liam broke the silence at last. "Dad, why did she dance with me?" Grant hesitated, then answered, "Because you asked." "But she could have said no," Liam pressed. "She could have laughed." "She didn't. Why?" Grant felt the question burrow into him. "Because she respected you," he said slowly, the words tasting unfamiliar. Liam looked up then, his eyes filled with something new. "Will she teach me again?" Grant swallowed hard. His empire could bend governments, yet here he was, struggling to answer a child. "We will see," he said, though he already knew the answer was yes. By Friday, Liam entered Freedom Steps for the first time. He wore his braces polished to a dull shine, his hands clenched tight on his crutches. The children inside stopped to look, not with pity but with curiosity, one of their own recognizing another. Maya greeted him with a nod. Not a gush of sympathy, not a lecture, just a welcome that carried the weight of respect. Grant stood at the door, stiff and unsure, but Maya ignored his presence. She guided Liam toward the mats, her voice low and firm. "Here you choose the steps. No one pulls you. No one decides for you." Liam's lips tightened. His eyes darted to his father, but then he nodded, determination trembling inside his small frame. The session began, and with every uneven step, every scrape of metal against wood, every falter and recovery, Grant felt the walls he had built inside himself begin to crack. Hours later, when the children had gone and the hall was quiet, Grant remained. He stared at the posters, at the words painted in messy strokes, "Every move counts." "Lead when you're ready." Maya began folding mats, her body tired but her face serene. He asked finally, "How do you keep this place alive?" "Donations," she answered, "fundraisers, side jobs, and hope." "Mostly hope." His jaw tightened. "Hope does not pay rent." She straightened, looking at him with the same steady defiance she had shown in his tower. "Neither does fear," she replied. For a long moment, silence stretched between them again, but this time it was not a weapon. It was recognition. Grant left that night with the sound of children's laughter still echoing in his ears, a sound that haunted him more than any market loss could. The boardroom of Marshall Capital gleamed with cold precision. A vast oval table stretched beneath recessed lights, polished to the sheen of a mirror, surrounded by men and women in tailored suits whose lives revolved around numbers, risk, and gain. They spoke in clipped phrases about mergers, funds, and quarterly projections, their voices devoid of hesitation, for hesitation in this room was weakness. At the head of the table sat Grant Marshall, his presence commanding even when he did not speak. Yet this morning, his thoughts wandered far from the graphs projected onto the screen. He heard not the rise and fall of market trends, but the echo of laughter he had carried out of the Freedom Steps Hall a week earlier. The sound of children, unsteady, imperfect, joyous, had intruded into the sterile rhythm of his empire. As his chief financial officer droned about a possible downturn, Grant's hand tightened on his pen until his knuckles whitened. He had seen something money could not replicate. Worse, he had felt it, and now his empire, always obedient, was beginning to resist. When the meeting concluded, 3 of his senior advisors lingered. Miss Quinn among them, her expression drawn sharper than usual as though she had been preparing for this conversation. They spoke carefully, but the message beneath their words was clear. Association with a failing community program, run by an outspoken waitress, would invite questions. Investors valued predictability, not sentiment. The press would twist it into weakness, into a distraction from the image of control he had built with ruthless discipline. One advisor suggested, with the smooth cruelty of practiced strategy, that Freedom Steps could be quietly purchased and absorbed into one of the many charitable arms of the Marshall Foundation. That way the program would continue under the Marshall name, but Maya would be erased, her defiance swallowed. Grant did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the window, to the skyline that pierced the morning fog. His empire was designed to control outcomes, yet for the first time in decades, he wondered if control was the enemy. Meanwhile, across the city, The warehouse where Freedom Steps struggled to survive carried its own storm. The landlord had delivered another notice, late rent. The mats were fraying, the mirrors cracked, and the electricity threatened to be cut off. Zoe Ellis paced the floor, her anger sharp, her words tumbling against the walls. "We cannot keep this alive, Maya. We work ourselves to the bone, and for what? For laughter that does not pay the bills." Maya sat quietly, folding the notices into neat squares before setting them aside. Her calmness only fueled Zoe's frustration. "You think dignity can pay the rent? You think refusing a billionaire's offer makes us noble? It makes us broke." But Maya's voice, steady as stone, answered, "It makes us free." Zoe turned away, tears hot on her cheeks because deep down she knew her sister was right. Yet the weight of survival pressed harder than ideals. At home, Liam had changed. He no longer shuffled silently through the penthouse. He asked questions that cut through his father's armor. "Why do we never laugh here? Why does everything feel heavy? Why can't we go back to Freedom Steps every day?" Grant tried to answer, but each attempt dissolved into silence. The boy who had once accepted control without protest was beginning to resist. He asked to choose his own clothes, to decide when he wanted to practice, to lead his own steps even if they ended in a stumble. The therapists noticed. They reported progress, but in hushed tones they admitted that what drove it was not their methods, but the time spent at the warehouse. Grant listened without reply, but his mind boiled. His empire demanded he pull back, silence the threat of exposure. Yet his son demanded something else: freedom. The clash came to a head when an investor dinner was scheduled at Kingsley's, the same restaurant where the dance had occurred. Grant arrived in a tailored suit, his face carved into composure, but inside he carried unease. The investors praised profits, toasted expansions, and spoke of controlling narratives. One leaned closer, his voice slick with wine, and said, "We heard you've been seen at some warehouse in the industrial district. Charity work is fine, Marshall, but too much sentiment makes the market nervous." Grant felt his chest tighten. For years he had allowed markets to dictate his every move. But when he looked down the table and saw the emptiness of men who measured life only in dividends, he felt a revulsion that startled him. In the polished reflection of his wineglass, he saw Liam's trembling smile, not the numbers flashing across trading floors. He excused himself before the dessert arrived, leaving investors murmuring behind him. That night, Grant stood alone on his balcony, the city sprawling beneath him in lights. His empire was secure, yet he felt more precarious than ever. He thought of Olivia, of her words whispered long ago about connection. He thought of Maya, her defiance, her calm dignity in the face of power. He thought of Liam, whose voice no longer trembled when he asked to lead. The air was cold, but it carried a clarity he could not ignore. He realized that if he silenced Freedom Steps, he would not only betray Maya and Zoe, but betray his son. Yet to stand with them meant risking everything he had built. The decision pressed on him with the weight of stone. Still, somewhere deep within, a crack formed in his certainty, and through it slipped the possibility of something he had long forgotten: change. The gala was held in a ballroom that seemed designed to intimidate. Golden chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like captured sunlight. Marble pillars stood in rigid symmetry, and every table gleamed with crystal and silver polished to a mirror's edge. Grant Marshall had hosted countless evenings here, each one a display of his empire's strength, each one attended by men and women who thrived on the certainty of his control. Yet tonight, as he stood near the stage, he felt no certainty. His tie was knotted perfectly, his suit cut with precision, but beneath the fabric his chest carried a weight that could not be tailored away. He was expected to announce another expansion of his foundation, another initiative polished for press releases, another demonstration that Marshall Capital did not merely consume but gave back. The advisors had prepared every word for him, a speech crafted to soothe investors and dazzle media. But the words on the page felt hollow, heavy as stone, and Grant knew if he spoke them, his son would look at him with the same quiet disappointment that had begun to sharpen in his eyes. At the edge of the room, Maya Ellis entered in a simple black dress, her sister Zoe at her side. They were out of place among the gowns and jewels. Yet they carried themselves with dignity that turned heads in spite of whispers. They had not come as guests. They had come because Grant had insisted, overriding his advisor's fury, placing their names on the list himself. Maya walked not with deference but with steady calm, her presence a reminder of defiance in a hall built on obedience. Liam followed, his braces clicking softly against the marble, his small figure dwarfed by the towering wealth around him, yet somehow commanding more attention than the billionaires who filled the tables. Conversations faltered, laughter thinned, and the orchestra's polished notes seemed to lose their confidence as the boy moved through the room. Grant saw it all and felt the tide shifting. Tonight would not be another routine of dominance disguised as generosity. Tonight would demand truth. When the speeches began, the advisors watched with hawk-like eyes ready to smooth any misstep. Grant stepped to the podium, the prepared notes trembling faintly in his hand. He looked out over the sea of faces, the cameras, the reporters waiting for sound bites, the investors waiting for reassurance. He began with the expected phrases, the safe lines about growth and responsibility, but his voice faltered. In that pause, silence fell, and into it slipped the memory of steel braces scraping against polished wood, of a trembling boy leading 3 steps into a world that had always told him to follow. Grant lowered the papers. For years, he said slowly, I believed control was strength. I believed wealth could cure every wound, solve every problem, and command every life. But 2 weeks ago, I watched my son take 3 steps that cost him more courage than I have ever spent in my life. And in those steps, I saw that strength is not control. It is connection. The words rippled through the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Advisors stiffened, investors shifted uneasily, but Grant pressed forward. He spoke of freedom steps not as a charity but as a necessity, not as a program to be absorbed but as a sanctuary that revealed what money alone could never buy: dignity. He announced his commitment not to take it over, not to brand it, but to stand beside it. He pledged funding that would preserve its independence. He pledged support that would expand its reach, and he declared openly that it would remain in the hands of those who had built it, Maya and Zoe Ellis. Cameras flashed, whispers flared, but at the center of it all, Liam's smile broke into something radiant and undeniable. He reached for Maya's hand, and together they stepped forward. The boy leading with slow, uneven courage, the woman following with steady grace. The orchestra, sensing the moment, softened into a melody, and once again a room built for power found itself silenced by a child's dance. For Grant, the decision carried cost. Investors questioned his judgment. Headlines speculated on his sudden sentiment, and rivals whispered of weakness. Yet in the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Families wrote letters of gratitude. Strangers spoke of hope. And for the first time in years, Grant's empire did not expand through fear but through trust. Within his own home, change bloomed quietly but powerfully. Liam no longer asked permission for every step. He demanded space to try, to fail, to rise again. The penthouse filled with sound. Laughter, music from the Freedom Step sessions, the rhythm of braces striking floor not as burdens but as instruments of persistence. The silence that had once suffocated their lives was replaced with connection, imperfect but real. Maya continued her work at the center, her leadership unchanged, her dignity intact. She accepted Grant's support not as submission, but as partnership, a rare acknowledgement that power could stand beside, rather than above. Zoe, once bitter with fear, began to see the future stretch wider than survival. The children thrived, their movements uneven but beautiful, their voices filling the warehouse with a resilience that could not be silenced. And always at the heart of it Liam led, sometimes stumbling, sometimes steady but always leading, always proving that strength lies not in flawless steps but in the courage to take them at all. On an ordinary evening months later, Grant stood again in the warehouse, watching his son guide a younger child through the first shaky motions of a dance. The air smelled of varnish and sweat, the walls echoed with laughter, and the floor bore the scuff marks of hundreds of brave steps. Grant felt something stir inside him that years of conquest had never given him. It was not pride, not victory, not control. It was peace. He looked at Maya across the room, and their eyes met in silent acknowledgement. Neither spoke, for no words were needed. 3 steps had once tilted the axis of a room. Now countless steps had tilted the axis of a life. And for a man who had once believed money could purchase everything, that was the only fortune worth keeping.